Britain was using silver as currency, and America had to grow up and get its financial house in order. So America went on the gold standard instead in 1848, and that fired up the gold rush, as the gold in California became real money. Gold fever hit hard in San Francisco, and there were so many sailors abandoning their ships for the gold fields that they had to drag the empty ships out of the water to make parking places for more arriving every day. The abandoned ships were taken apart so the lumber could be used for new buildings, and Telegraph Hill was whittled away to make ballast for the ships returning to Seattle to pick up more lumber to build more gold mining camps in California. The ballast was used in Seattle as fill for that expanding city, where the mud flaps were built up to create land for new residents, and it only took a few years to collect all the surface gold in California while the rest had to be laboriously squeezed out of the ground. The mines in the mountains around Victor, Colorado, would yield more gold than California and Alaska combined, but the Rocky Mountain gold was bound up in an ore called gold telluride that needed to be heated to extreme temperatures to extract the gold. While in California and Alaska, gold was in the form of pure flakes and visible nuggets that could be simply washed out of the dirt, so the easier method attracted the majority of miners with the easy pickings along the west coast, rather than the difficult mining and challenging weather of the Colorado mountains. The gold telluride around Victor was mostly calaverite, named after Calaveras County in California, where two of the soldiers in Fremont's third expedition stayed to dig for gold as soon as California was admitted to the Union. The Angel brothers, Henry and George, had been the first to discover the new mineral called calaverite in California, and it had been named by the German chemist Friedrich Augustus Ludwig Karl Wilhelm Genth, who had moved to America in 1848 and stayed. And the Angel brothers had found calaverite at their Angels Camp in California, and Angels Camp was also known as the City of Angels. To get to California, people either had to go by ship to Panama and struggle overland to the Pacific, and then catch a ship north up the coast of Mexico, or they could go the long way around Magellan's Strait of All Saints at the base of South America, with its unpredictable storms and unreliable ocean currents. So the easier route turned out to be going by wagon train over the roads and trails mapped by Fremont. Before the gold rush, settlers had been moving steadily west by building rough log cabins and living in them until somebody else moved in close enough to see their smoke, and then it was time to move on. After Fremont walked all the way from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean on his second expedition in 1843, people had been drawn to California by Fremont's maps, and his South Pass in Wyoming at the Continental Divide was only 7,000 feet high, a rare opening through the Rocky Mountains less than 200 miles wide, and it was there that he gave his name to Fremont Peak. The Continental Divide was the line separating the East from the West, and it followed along the top of the Rocky Mountains from where all rivers had their origin. And to find the Continental Divide, explorers would follow a river to its source high in the mountains, and on the other side, rivers would flow towards the Pacific instead of towards the Atlantic, and a standard compass was every mountain man's best friend. The fractured granite of the Rocky Mountains acted as a sponge that stored snow as high as 14,000 feet and then released it steadily to sustain the rivers downstream as the snow melted deep into the granite rock from geothermal heat. And while Lewis and Clark had gone west by north to get to the Pacific Ocean, Fremont would go west by south after he got sick of snow. Moving west was not cheap, and not everybody could manage it, and lots of people took tools and seeds and animals with them when they went west because there was no way to make any money or find employment when they got there. and the pioneer lifestyle remained quite different from that of people living in the industrial cities back east. Wagon trains would gather in St. Louis on the mighty Mississippi River, and from there they would head straight west 220 miles up the Missouri River to Independence, just east of Kansas City, and then go another 250 miles across the prairie to the northwest until they reached Fort Kearny on the Platte River. Following the Platte River upstream from Fort Kearny toward the Rocky Mountains, they would travel through South Pass and then take the road west by following marked trails until the streams became rivers heading towards the Pacific, and the good people of Independence, Missouri would give each wagon train a free Bible as they launched out on their journey. After going through South Pass, the wagon trains going west set their sights on the next goal of reaching either Fort Bridger on the Black Fork of the Green River in Wyoming, or taking Greenwood's cutoff to Fort Hall in Idaho. And the Mormons heading to the Great Salt Lake would go through Fort Bridger and then south to follow Hastings' cutoff down to the Great Salt Lake. And going south to California would commit the wagon trains to an arduous journey through the high desert. Marcus had gone 150 miles northwest to Fort Hall from Fort Bridger, and Fort Hall was 700 miles away from Fort Kearny, and it was at Fort Hall where the pioneers finally reached the Snake River that was flowing downstream into the Pacific Ocean. The Whitmans followed the Snake River towards the Promised Land until it turned directly to the north at the Idaho-Oregon border, right where the Malheur River branched off due west from the Snake. And that was 230 miles away from Fort Hall at a place that the French called Malheur Territory. It was at Fort Hall in Idaho where Marcus had led the first church service in the Wild West, and there at Fort Hall the pioneers would decide which way to go, northwest to the Promised Land of Oregon Territory or southwest towards California. After turning sharply north, the Snake River finally met the Columbia River at Kennewick, or Pasco to the Germans, and Pasco was another 200 miles northwest of the Malheur River. And the Whitman mission was 30 miles away from Pasco. The way west took half a year, one step at a time, and the Indians were usually not cooperative. And the beginning of the trail was easy enough because the prairie was level with plenty of grass and water, so the pioneers had time to get used to traveling in their wagon trains before they hit the mountains. Moving along the trail, pioneers would lighten their load. Moving along the trail, pioneers would lighten their load by throwing stuff off to the side, and those coming later would pick it up to carry it for a while, then throw it away again. And every so often there would be a grave. Fremont's maps were more accurate than the other book being read by pioneers called Hastings' Emigrant's Guide, which the Donner Party would use as their guide going west. And Congress had printed 10,000 copies of Jesse's story about Fremont's second expedition. And Fremont had almost died in the snow by Donner's Pass on his second expedition in the same place the Donner Party would suffer the same fate 3 years later. There was a southern route to California that was called the Santa Fe Trail, but most American pioneers went north along the Oregon Trail and turned south at Fort Bridger to take the California Trail that went along the Humboldt River, rather than taking the Santa Fe Trail that simply dead-ended in the Arizona desert. Santa Fe was west of Texas and was the second oldest town in America, second only to Florida's city of St. Augustine that had the oldest church, and Santa Fe in Spanish meant Holy Covenant, and the town of Santa Fe had attracted many Germans. The Conestoga wagon had been a German invention, and Mr. George Donner was of German descent, and in German Donner meant thunder, but in German slang it was used as a swear word. The name was originally spelled Donner with an H, and the Donners were descended from the German donors that had come to Pennsylvania from Germany around 1700. And Mr. Donner was a Mason, a good citizen, and a successful businessman. Mr. Donner put an ad in the newspaper in Illinois asking people to join his wagon train heading west. And he said that they could come along for free and that the government would give them free land in California. And only 4 people had answered his ad. Donner sold his 240-acre farm in Illinois that had fruit orchards with standing timber on 1/3 of the land, and he sewed $10,000 into a quilt kept in his covered wagon, and most of the other family members wore money belts containing large amounts of cash. The Donners took an abundance of belongings with them, such as a mirror and a cook stove, as well as a decent library collection and a healthy selection of fine wines. And the fancy goods loaded into the Donners' wagon was intended to impress people when they arrived in California. People assumed they could migrate to California even though it was not part of the United States. And they believed that when the Indians and the Mexicans and the Spaniards saw the settlers, they would want to become Americans too. When the wagon train left on the 15th of April in 1846, Abraham Lincoln was too busy to show up to say goodbye, but Lincoln sent his wife and son Robert to wave at the departing Donners. The wagon train was called the Donner-Reed Party, and James Reed and Abraham Lincoln had been in the army together, and Reed's family had come to America around 1780, migrating by way of Ireland. Reed was also a Mason and had been born in Northern Ireland from good Irish blood, but attitudes toward the Irish in America being what it was, Reed told everyone that he'd come from noble Polish stock before his family had moved to Ireland. Reed was 45 years old when he joined the Donner Party, and he had married a Virginia gentlewoman prone to headaches, and after moving to Illinois, Reed's wife suffered from the indoor disease of whiskey and opiate self-medication, and so Reed had enthusiastically joined the Donner Party. Many who joined wagon trains were simply rich people out for a thrill, and they would bring their servants with them, and the people who signed on with the Donner Party were mostly upper-middle-class people who enjoyed meeting at each other's homes to read books and poetry out loud. And Fremont's book had quickly become one of their favorites, along with Hastings' description of California, where nobody was ever cold in the winter and crops grew all year long. Lansford Hastings had gone over the Sierras in 1842, and he wrote his Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California about that trip 3 years later in 1845, and on paper his trail appeared to be 300 miles shorter than any other map, but there was the Mercator problem in Hastings' drawings, and his book had just come out, and nobody had yet been able to test it for accuracy. Hastings was a lawyer who had his eye on getting elected governor of California, and he needed people to come out to California to vote for him so that the new state would be admitted as a slave state. And Hastings had many pro-slavery financial backers from the South, and he would fight for the Confederacy in the war between the states. The General Kearny that Fort Kearny had been named after was also pro-slavery, and the nearby town of Kearny in Kansas would add an E before the Y when the slave states lost the war between the states to distance themselves from General Kearny, and they also began pronouncing it either Kearny or Carney, so it sounded more like the word carnival. When the Donner Party reached Laramie, the whole town had been drunk, especially the Indians, and an old army buddy of Reed's was there and warned them not to take Hastings' cutoff. This army buddy had been on the 1842 trip with Hastings, but Mrs. Reed thought he was dressed rather shabbily in buckskins, and she didn't like the way he smelled, and she convinced her husband Reed not to believe him. Mrs. Donner, however, believed the army friend, but Mrs. Donner's husband dismissed her opinion outright, and he chose to believe the people who were invested in business at Fort Bridger, which had become a tourist trap for covered wagons. Everyone was taking the Greenwood cutoff to Fort Hall instead of going through Fort Bridger, and the Greenwood cutoff made the journey to Oregon 85 miles shorter, even though it required going overland 40 miles without water, so the investors at Fort Bridger had been touting Hastings as a reliable source. A friend of Donner named Bryant, who was a journalist, had mailed letters to the Donners warning them not to take Hastings Cutoff, but the letters sat unopened at Fort Bridger, and one of the people who had gone with Fremont across that same area also told the Donners not to take Hastings' route, but instead Reed wrote a letter to a newspaper editor back home saying that some very excellent and accommodating gentlemen had recommended the Hastings Cutoff. With their reading and writing skills, people in the Donner Party would keep diaries along the trail. And one of them included the insight that wealthier members believed they were not responsible for cutting firewood. The Donner Party stopped for an entire day to celebrate the 4th of July because it was America's 70th birthday. And the Donners sang songs and read the Declaration of Independence, and someone made a speech. And on the 4th of August, the wagon train reached the Red Fork of the Weber River, where they saw a sign and a letter stuck to a nearby bush. The letter was from Hastings, who was 2 weeks ahead of them on the trail, and the letter warned that the road ahead was too bad to follow. Hastings' letter said that the Donners should send someone ahead on horseback, and that Hastings would return with them to point out a better route. So Reed and 2 others went ahead to catch up with Hastings, but instead of returning as a guide, Hastings only rode with them to the top of a hill and pointed towards the better way. The new route turned out to be terrible, a trail Hastings had made on his way back from California that spring, and he had blazed it only after getting lost away from Fremont's trail. And his group had been riding mules. The Donner Party took a vote and decided to go the new suggested way, and they went 2 miles the first day, 2 miles the next day, and 2 miles the day after that, and then one of them got into a knife fight trying to pass on a hill when the wagons got tangled. The one trying to pass had started beating the oxen belonging to Reed, and Reed showed up and was hit in the face with a whip handle. So Mrs. Reed stepped in and was hit in the head, and Reed pulled out a knife and used it, killing the driver. A trial was convened that mostly went against Reed, and the German named Keseberg had been the most hostile, and he propped up his axle-tree for a hanging. But a few took Reed's side, and the Reed supporters had more guns, so they voted to banish Reed instead, sending him away on horseback, while his wife and children stayed with the wagons. 2 weeks later, the Donner Party reached the Great Salt Lake Plain, while a mule could have done it in 2 days instead of 2 weeks, and it was already the 21st of August. The cutoff Hastings described in his book was only 2/3 as long as the route from Fort Hall, but instead of getting to the Salt Lake in a week, it had taken them 30 days, after which the salt desert they had to walk across was a thick crust of salt with soft, wet mud underneath. And while they thought they could make it in 2 days, it took them 6. In the meantime, 36 oxen had gone missing, and some Indians came riding up and told them where the cattle were, but the wagon train had learned not to trust Indians. Many of the wagons in the Donner Party were left behind in that salt desert, and it snowed while they were still in the salt flats, and when they'd finally gotten through Hastings Cutoff and over the salt desert and back onto the regular trail, they found that the other wagon trains that had passed throughout the summer had eaten all the grass, so their animals would go hungry all the way through the Humboldt Basin. Indians plagued the Donner Party by shooting arrows into their animals, and the arrows were not enough to kill them, but only weakened them enough that they died slowly, and the Indians would also steal their cattle in the middle of the night. The Donner Party finally reached the Truckee River on the 15th of October, right after the Hastings wagon train had gotten through to California over the pass in the Sierra Nevada mountains. and the Donner wagon train stopped to rest for a few days by the pleasant Truckee River, and then it started to snow. When the Donner Party finally got moving, they were one day too late to get through the pass. And while the leaders tried to get them up and over, the majority were more interested in just getting one more day's rest. The first one to wake up the next morning couldn't even see the others because the snow had quietly covered them. The snow that had quietly covered them was so deep, and they tried to move forward, but it was hopeless, so they backtracked to the lake to construct some shelter, and at this point they were no longer working together, and the Donners were still 5 miles downhill behind them. A cabin had been built by the lake by a stranded group 2 years previously, and they built a lean-to onto one side of it, and 400 yards away they built another cabin using a huge boulder as one of its walls, and a family with 9 children built a cabin another half-mile away, and 60 people would live in these improvised shelters for the winter, half of them children. Forcing Reed away had hurt them because he was a smart man and a good organizer, and they also might have made better progress had they left more of their possessions behind on the trail, but they had not wanted to arrive in California as poor people. The heavy snow started on the 4th of November, and the Donners, along with some others, built a small cabin by the Truckee River 5 miles down the trail, and 15 people would live in this 12 by 14 cabin that had quickly become buried in the snow with the chimneys barely clearing. These 2 settlements would visit back and forth as often as they found the strength, but the 2 camps remained mostly isolated from each other due to the difficulty of getting through the massive depth of snowfall. The wagon train had started with 88 people, the same number that had sailed with Christopher Columbus when he discovered America, and the Donner Party ate the mice that came into their cabins, and then they ate leather by boiling it to make a sort of glue soup. The people at the lake had seen some fish, but they couldn't catch them because the water had become too cold for the fish to bite, and the people of the wagon train started to die. 4 of the families had 7 children, and 7 other families had an average of 2 toddlers each, and there were 22 other single adults among them. And while 48 people would survive the winter, 40 people from the wagon train would perish before reaching California. The hired help were terribly discouraged, overwhelmed by the task of cutting wood for so many people, and there was not enough food available to give them the energy to chop the wood, while the party members didn't understand why the hired help wasn't bringing in more firewood. The first person to suggest that they draw lots to kill somebody for food just happened to be the first to die and get eaten. And 3 people would die before they began using the dead as food, and 4 of the hired help died on the same day, and the diaries say they just lay down and gave up. An Indian brought them some roots once, and they were surprised that an Indian could behave kindly, having gotten used to Indians on the prairie who didn't think it was bad manners to ride up to the wagons and look inside at the women. Meanwhile, Reed had reached Sutter's Mill on the 28th of October in 1846, where Fremont had been on his 3rd expedition the previous winter. And Fremont had arrived at Sutter's Mill on the 9th of December in 1845 to sound his clarion call for recruits for the war with Mexico. The formal declaration of war was made in May of 1846 before the Donner Party had even reached South Pass, and Fremont had commandeered Sutter's Mill as a military post, and as Reed arrived, a messenger rode in calling for every available man to come fight for America, so Reed enlisted, along with the journalist who had mailed the letters to Fort Bridger. Reed wanted to be appointed as an officer, but word had spread from the Hastings wagon train about the missing Donners, and Fremont got wind of the stranded wagon train and ordered Reed to go help them. But he had to bribe Reed with a lieutenancy to get him to do it. Fremont also encouraged Reed with the directive that he would be able to recruit other soldiers along the way, and Reed began gathering food and pack animals to go rescue the Donner Party. And he left Sutter's Mill on Halloween, and Reed would fulfill the true meaning of the holiday of Halloween, when neighbors would visit each other's homes to find out who was still alive before the hard winter set in. The remainder of the story was that 17 of the Donner Party made a break for it on the 16th of December, and they decided to follow 2 local Indians who would finally admit they were lost, and the Indians ran away when they were warned by some in the group that a few were planning to kill them to eat them, and after the Indians left, one of the group died and was eaten by the others. Another person died and was also eaten, and then the breakout group caught up with the 2 Indians, whose trail was easy to follow because their feet were bleeding, and shot them dead and ate them. On the 12th of January, the breakaway group arrived at an Indian camp and were given acorn bread to eat, and then the Indians passed them along from tribe to tribe until they reached a European-American settlement, and it had taken them a month to get there, and only 7 were left alive, 5 of whom were women, and they said that the women had stood the ordeal better than the men. By the time a first rescue party showed up at Donner's Pass on the 19th of February, 2 weeks before a second rescue party led by Reed would arrive, 13 people by the lake had died, and down by the river, Mrs. Donner told the first rescue party that they would have to start eating the dead soon, but the way she said it made them think she knew what had been going on up at the lake. The first rescue party left for California after 3 days, taking the survivors who were healthy enough to walk, and just after they headed out, an 11-year-old would die. 7 men of the first rescue team led 13 people and 5 children away from the lake, among them Keseberg's wife and her daughter, who would die the second night out, and 2 of the younger children would be returned to the lake because they couldn't keep up. When they reached their first food cache, it had been eaten by wild animals, so they had to walk through the snow for 4 more days without food, and 1 man among them just sat down and died. 21 people had been left at the lake, with 12 more remaining behind down by the river. And the first relief heading down into California met the second rescue party being led by Reed coming up towards Donner's Pass, and they would arrive at the lake on the 1st of March. Reed had first gathered 30 horses, a mule, a beef hindquarter, and 2 Indians to rescue the Donner Party, but the snow had been too deep, and there had been 40 feet of snow when they got to Donner Pass, so Reed had abandoned the attempt and returned to Sutter's Mill, where Captain Sutter told him to go to San Francisco to seek help in rescuing the Donner Party, specifically to get help from the Navy. Reed had abandoned the attempt and returned to Sutter's Mill, where Captain Sutter... I don't know what's so hard about this. Reed had abandoned the attempt and returned to Sutter's Mill, where Captain Sutter told him to go to San Francisco to seek help in rescuing the Donner Party, specifically to get help from the Navy. Reed went to San Francisco and fought Mexicans for a while at the Battle of Santa Clara, and peace with Mexico was declared on the 13th of January, and Reed went to San Jose to visit some prominent citizens who signed a petition to rescue the Donners. Reed took the petition to a private fundraiser that was held at a local saloon, and 200 people at the saloon raised $1,300 to save the Donners. But before the rescue party could get underway, Reed bought a big piece of San Jose he hoped would become the capital of California. And then Reed found some men willing to go save the wagon train for pay, and he rented a boat and headed up the Sacramento River. The men in Reed's relief party were being paid $1.50 per day, but would be given a raise to $3 when they reached the deep snow, and that would become $5 a day before they arrived at the Donner Party camp on the 1st of March. Reed's relief team spent only 2 days at the camp before leaving to go back to California, taking everyone from the river except Mrs. Donner, her dying husband, with their 3 children, the Frenchman and the Donner sister-in-law with her 2 youngest children, as well as the 2 rescuers from the first relief, who had stayed behind at the river to help out, and one of them went to stay at the lake to give Keseberg a bath. Just 1 day down the trail, it started to snow on Reed with a vengeance. Then it snowed for another day and night, and 1 little boy died. And when it finally stopped snowing, 7 of them continued on, while the rest stayed behind, sitting next to their open fire. When the 3rd rescue party found them, the fire had melted its way down through 25 feet of snow, and the group was living at the bottom of a snow cave 14 feet wide, and they had eaten 2 children and 1 mother. Back at the lake, the dead cattle that had pulled their wagons were finally appearing through the snow, whenever the snow stopped falling for a while. But the meat would thaw and start to rot, and those at the lake didn't cut it up to dry over a fire like those stranded in the snow pit had been doing. Down by the river, the same storm that had hit Reed's rescue party on his way out had killed Mrs. Donner's sister-in-law and her 3-year-old. So Mrs. Donner had taken charge of the other surviving child, and Mrs. Donner had offered to pay the 2 rescuers who had stayed behind a great deal of money to take her 3 children out of there. But they only took them as far as the lake and left them with Keseberg, who took 4-year-old Georgie, named after his father, George Donner, to bed with him one night a few days later, and by morning the little boy had died. Mrs. Murphy hollered that Keseberg was a murderer, but he just hung the dead child up on the wall for a while, then took him down and carved him up, and everybody got their share. The snow had been sublimating enough that there were patches of dry ground appearing, and that meant the wagons were no longer buried in snow, and after leaving the children with Keseberg, the 2 rescuers had caught up with the 2nd rescue party, and their packs had been full of fancy stuff taken from the wagons. When a 3rd rescue party showed up on the 13th of March, it was comprised of 4 men, including the fathers of the 2 little boys left behind by the 2nd relief, and Keseberg told them he had just eaten their sons, and they were astounded that he had not eaten the cattle sticking half out of the snow instead, and when they went down to the river, they found that Mrs. Donner even looked a little plump. The 3rd rescue party left after only 2 hours, so now the only people left behind were Keseberg and the invalid Mrs. Murphy and Mrs. Donner with her dying husband down by the river, who had injured his hand and the infection had spread up to his shoulder. The 3rd rescue party left these last survivors alone for a whole month because nobody was in any hurry to go back up there. Keseberg had gotten off to a bad start when the wagon train first hit the prairie by robbing a buffalo robe from an Indian's grave. And then he'd left the old man who was riding with him behind on the trail to die, and the old man had been driving when Keseberg's wagon tipped over, putting bruises and cuts on Keseberg's wife. But the old man knew she had those injuries before the wagon flipped, and when Keseberg forced him out and left him to die, that witness to what everyone suspected had been silenced. Many in the wagon train were careful to record the incident in their diaries because they knew Keseberg was in the habit of beating his wife, and they held Keseberg responsible for the suspicious abandonment. Keseberg's full name was Johann Ludwig Christian Keseberg, but they called him Louis, and he had been an educated man, over 6 feet tall and blond and military-like, and Keseberg had fought in the Prussian army. Keseberg had fought in the Prussian army, and he had no friends in the wagon train because Germans were considered foreigners. Keseberg had lived in America for only 2 years, and his wife was only 24 years old and a Catholic and pregnant again, and they already had 2 small children, and while many in the wagon train knew that he beat his wife, the ones who refused to believe it called her a flirt in their diaries. Keseberg had been born in Berleburg, Germany, where Keseberg had become a brewer, and his father had been a Protestant minister, and while he was the only German, the wagon train also had one Spanish man and one from Holland, and they had picked up the Frenchman at Fort Bridger. One of the Donner Party members was known for constantly quoting Shakespeare, but Keseberg was actually the most educated of them, and Keseberg spoke French that he had learned in school, and he'd been fond of visiting Paris, where he would practice his French while on business. Mrs. Tamsen Donner also spoke French, and had been looking forward to teaching it to the young ladies of California. And Tamsen was George Donner's third wife, and she was 17 years his junior. Mrs. Donner had 5 grown children. Mr. Donner had 5 grown children from his first marriage, 2 teenage daughters from his deceased second wife, and the 3 young children belonging to Tamsen, the youngest of whom was 3 years old. Keseberg was 32 years old, and Tamsen was 45, and Mr. Donner was 62 years of age, and romance on the trail west was rampant, with there being as many weddings as funerals. While Keseberg's pregnant wife had gone ahead with the first rescuers, Tamsen had told them she wanted to stay behind, which the rescuers thought was odd. Tamsen also had refused to go with the second relief party, insisting she had to stay to take care of her dying husband, George Donner. And when the third rescue party showed up, Tamsen was living in Keseberg's cabin and again refused to go to California, saying that her dying husband down at the river needed her to take care of him. Because Tamsen was at the lake instead of at the river camp with Mr. Donner, Tamsen explained to the rescuers that the man who had stayed behind at the lake from the second rescue party and another man were down at the river taking care of both her dying husband and her nephew, and when the third relief party left, Tamsen had still been healthy. The fourth rescue party came over the pass on the 15th of April, made up of 7 men with salvage rights to half of what had been left behind by the Donner Party, but Tamsen was nowhere to be found. The snow had partially melted by that time, and there were bones laying around everywhere, and one of the skulls had a hatchet mark in it, and there were Indians lurking in the area. The camp at the lake was deserted, and Keseberg was down by the river, living in the Donner's shelter that was full of furniture and all the stuff from the Donner's wagon. And they suspected that Keseberg had murdered Tamsen, but Keseberg said she'd gone crazy, and she'd been out of her mind and wandering off by herself. Keseberg told them that Tamsen had been unable to take care of herself anymore, and that she would ramble around in the dark looking for her children, and on one of these midnight walks she'd fallen into a stream, and showed up at his cabin wearing wet clothes, out of her mind and screaming about her children. Keseberg said she'd wanted to walk over Donner Pass without anyone to guide her, and Keseberg said he persuaded her to stay, and that she was hungry but refused to eat the dead people he had offered to her. And Keseberg said she finally lay down, and that he put a feather bed and a blanket around her, and by morning she had died. They never found the body of Tamsen or her nephew, and there was a big pot of Mr. Donner's stew on the fire, even though there was plenty of beef still around in the pockets of deep snow, cold and fresh and unused, and the salvage party said that Keseberg had been eating people even after the snow had melted enough to find the cattle, and that he made soup out of people's brains and didn't bother to bury their bones. While Tamsen had told the first relief they soon would have to start eating the dead, one of the men at the lake had written in his diary, "They have done it ere this." And other diaries recorded that they had started eating people on the 25th of February, 6 days after the first relief left, but it may simply have been the first time they were willing to put that down on paper, now that the situation had become known to the outside world. When the salvage party showed up, Not only had Keseberg's diary been destroyed, but so was Tamsin's, and one of these fourth rescuers was married to one of Mrs. Murphy's daughters, and his wife was one of the rescued survivors, and he found the body of his brother-in-law with the brains, liver, and lungs removed. Keseberg was carrying Mr. Donner's pistols and had Mr. Donner's gold coins in his pockets and was wearing his fine clothes and jewelry, and while Keseberg insisted that the money was his, Keseberg's wife would tell the court in California that he had very little money of his own. The salvage party loaded up with 100 pounds of booty apiece, then put a rope around Keseberg's neck and got him to confess where he'd hidden the rest of the money belonging to Mr. Donner's orphaned children, and when Keseberg had buried, which Keseberg had buried by a large tree down by the river. The salvage team went looking for the Donner's money, and when they went back to get Keseberg, he was no longer around the river camp. So they followed fresh tracks in the snow for miles before the tracks doubled back to the river camp, and they went back up to the lake where they found Keseberg smoking a pipe and eating liver and lungs. Keseberg told them that everyone else was dead, and told them that Tamsin's husband had died in her arms, and that she had wrapped him in a sheet and gone looking for her children. Keseberg would claim in court that he had promised Tamsin he would give her husband's money to her children, and he had confessed that he knew Tamsin had offered the third rescue party $1,500 to take her children out, 3 times the amount she had offered the 2 staying behind from the second rescue party, and Keseberg also said that the third rescuers had refused to take the money. Keseberg's story to the court included his spending days after her death trying to summon the strength to fulfill his promise of finding Mr. Donner's money for the children, but said he'd gotten lost on the way back to the lake and had fallen into a creek and almost drowned, so Keseberg had gone to sleep at the river camp and awakened to find his stuff broken into and his own guns missing, and that was when the salvage team had showed up, confronting him about the Donner's gold, and Keseberg said he thought they were robbers, which is why he had lied to them, and Keseberg answered to the court with some confusion about exactly when he had become a cannibal. Keseberg had been living alone at the lake, but after the first rescue party left, he had moved in with the Breens, where he had to step over what was left of Milt, and the Breens had let him in because they didn't want to chop wood, so they could spend all their time praying instead, and the Breens would help Keseberg's eat 2 of Tamsin's children. The salvage party accused Keseberg of killing Tamsin because there was a bucket of blood in his lake cabin, along with a 10-pound piece of beef cut from one of the 3 oxen legs hanging in Tamsin's cabin down by the river, where pieces of Mr. Donner were sitting by the pots over the fire, and his brain had been missing. The salvage party believed Tamsin had brought Keseberg that piece of meat as soon as her husband had died, and they didn't believe Keseberg's story about Tamsin showing up hungry, but thought she had come up to the lake to tell him that her husband was dead, and that Tamsin had become concerned because Mrs. Murphy had disappeared. The salvage party left on the 23rd of April, dragging Keseberg along with them, and they dropped him off at Sutter's Mill, that had now become Sutter's Fort, where Keseberg was made the captain of the ferry that ran back and forth from San Francisco. Keseberg said they refused to pay him, and then Sutter fired him because people were afraid to go with Keseberg on the ferry, and he started a hotel in San Francisco and then sold it, but it burned to the ground before the new owner could give Keseberg the money. And then Keseberg opened the Phoenix Brewery and sold it, but a flood carried the brewery away before the buyer had paid for it. When Keseberg had finally gotten to California, he liked to shock people with his descriptions of the Donner Party disaster, and he told the story to as many people as he could, but the Californians had gotten tired of hearing about it pretty quickly, because it was just another of many tales of the Wild West, and they also thought the Donner Party had it coming because they had bickered on the trail, and Sutter thought the whole thing was just rich folks complaining. Keseberg's wife would have 9 more children, and 4 of them would die. And the 2 youngest girls were brain damaged and violent and physically impaired, and one of the children was obese. And when Mrs. Keseberg died, her husband took care of them by locking them in their room where they would scream all day, and Keseberg had to move away from town, but not before ending up in court in 1856 for beating up one of his employees. A man named McGlashan interviewed Keseberg and became convinced not only of his innocence in Tamsen's death, but also of his report that she never ate anyone. After talking with Keseberg, McGlashan helped dig up another stash of buried money from the Donner Party belonging to the Graves family, and then he wrote a book called History of the Donner Party, A Tragedy of the Sierra, that was published in 1940 by the Stanford University Press. One historian said that the wealthy people of the wagon train had trusted Hastings because he was one of their own class, and that George Donner's, quote, elderly dignity was mistaken for wisdom, his material prosperity was confused with intelligence and experience, close quote. For fear we shall perish, the story of the Donner Party disaster by Joseph Pigney, New York, E.P. Dutton and Company, Incorporated, 1961, page 58. A good number of dead tree trunks remain at the lake, sticking up like tombstones where the Donner Party cut them off at Snowline for firewood, and one trunk is 22 feet tall. And Pigney said that instead of thinking about how to get through the killer cutoff, they had spent every hour thinking, damn glad that part's over. The Hastings cut-off road they had hacked out of the mountains would be used by the Mormons going to the Great Salt Lake, which the Mormons would call Pratt's Cutoff after finishing the final canyon the Donners had spurned. And the Donners had gone straight over the mountain rather than continuing to complete the road Hastings had pointed out when Reed took the 2 men with him to meet Hastings ahead on the trail, and one of those men had been the one always quoting Shakespeare. After the disaster of the Donner Party, Hastings stopped exploring and became a full-time lawyer, and in English the name Hastings sounded like being in a hurry, so the moral of the story was written in a letter by Virginia Reed in May of 1847, quote, never take no cut-offs and hurry along as fast as you can, close quote. And one of the most interesting facts about the Donner Party was that they never ran out of tobacco. After people became disillusioned with Hastings' book, they relied instead on Fremont's maps, which pioneers called their trail Bibles. And Fremont's 3rd expedition had lasted throughout the Donner Party's ordeal. Fremont had left from St. Louis in June of 1845 with 74 men, and his 3rd expedition had set out when there were only a few thousand people of European origin living in California. And when Fremont had showed up in California, he was dressed in rawhide and buckskin and was wearing bandanas on his head. The locals were more than enthusiastic to see Fremont and made a flag for themselves, emblazoned with a bear, to show Fremont how united behind America they were, and most of them were drinking an excessive amount of alcohol as they rallied behind Fremont. The bear flaggers were opposed to the Mexican government that had done nothing to protect them from Indian raids, and they believed the Mexicans had been actively encouraging the Indians to attack American settlers, so the arrival of Fremont gave the Californians hope that the U.S. government would build forts and send soldiers to keep the Indians at bay, and Captain Fremont was embraced as their savior. Fremont had named the Golden Gate when he was there the year before, and this time he borrowed money to buy Alcatraz Island, and Fremont had arrived in California with 60 men in December of 1845 after stationing over a dozen of them at Sutter's Mill, and the Mexican governor ordered Fremont to leave the Bay Area immediately. President Polk had been elected in November of 1844 and took office in March of 1845. And Polk sent Fremont on this third expedition right away with secret orders not to attack the Mexicans, but to negotiate a treaty with them, and Fremont did have the authority to defend himself. So in March of 1846, he hunkered down with his men for a while on a California hill under the American flag, 15 miles inland from Monterey Bay, and then he took his men back up to Sutter's Mill, which had now become a fort. Acting under Mr. Buchanan's advice, President Polk, in his first annual message of December 2, 1845, not only reasserted the Monroe Doctrine in general terms, but distinctly declared that no future European colony or dominion shall, with the consent of the United States, be planted or established on any part of the American continent. This declaration was confined to North America in order to make it emphatically applicable to California. Emphatically applicable to California. To Mr. Benton and other governing men in Washington, it seemed reasonably sure that California would eventually fall to England or to the United States, and they were firmly resolved to hold it for the United States. The instructions early sent and repeatedly insisted upon to the officers commanding our Pacific squadron gave specific orders, emphasis, to be strictly followed in the event of war, end emphasis. For me, no distinct course or definite instruction could be laid down, but the probabilities were made known to me, as well as what to do when they became facts. The distance was too great for timely communication, but failing this emphasis, I was given discretion to act, end emphasis, and for this, as soon as war was sure between Mexico and ourselves, Lieutenant Gillespie was dispatched with instructions and with letters which, if intercepted, were when crossing Mexico, would convey no meaning to others, while to me they would be clear. The Century Illustrated Magazine, Volume 41, April 1891, The Conquest of California by John C. Fremont, page 920. At Sutter's Fort, Fremont started recruiting men to fulfill his mission in California, but he didn't have to seek them out because they flocked to him on their own, intent on obtaining protection from the relentless Indian raids. Fremont's quote-unquote army was a strange multinational force of buckskin rogues and filibusterers. One non-combatant observer described them as, quote, Americans, French, English, Swiss, Poles, Russians, Chileans, Germans, Greeks, Austrians, and Pawnees, close quote. Blood and Thunder, an epic of the American West by Hampton Sides, New York. Anchor Books, a division of Random House, Incorporated, 2006, page 118. The secret orders from President Polk told Fremont to prepare to fight the British over possession of the entire West Coast, all the way up to Vancouver Island. And Fremont was supposed to get California into the Union as a non-slave state, while the Army faction in the government wanted to turn Southern California into a slave state. Polk told Fremont that negotiations were underway for Britain to leave the Pacific Northwest below the boundary of the 49th latitude. And the timing was perfect because the British were busy with their opium wars in China and had no interest at that time in getting into another shooting war with America. On the 1st of November in 1845, Polk sent Marine Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie with orders for the Navy that was parked off the shores of Northern California, and the dispatch had included specific orders for Captain Fremont. Gillespie went by steamship from New York to Veracruz, then overland to Mazatlan, and by whaling ship to Hawaii, then east to California on an American man-o'-war, whereupon Gillespie headed up the Sacramento River in search of Fremont, who had established a northern base at the Upper Klamath Lake in Oregon. By the time Gillespie got to California, Things had gotten rather out of hand because when Fremont had gone back to San Francisco to complete his purchase of Alcatraz Island, he had gotten waylaid by the Bear Flaggers, who were swearing allegiance to Captain Fremont and would refuse to submit to the Army's General Kearny when he showed up a year later and tried to order Fremont out of California. Lieutenant Gillespie claimed to have destroyed the paper orders from Polk during his journey to California, and said that he had committed them to memory out of fear they might be confiscated by Mexicans. The local Bear Flaggers told Gillespie exactly where to find Fremont up the Sacramento River at Sutter's Fort, and from there Gillespie borrowed a horse and went north to Oregon and found Fremont on the 8th of May, delivering the orders from Polk, and President Polk had sent Gillespie because Texas had just been admitted as a slave state. The vote to make Texas the 28th state had gone through the Democratic Congress, and President Polk would have to sign it by Christmas of 1845, so that meant California would have to come in free, and Polk knew that Fremont was the man for the job. One faction in Washington, D.C. wanted to split California into two states, a northern California that was free and a southern California that was slaveholding, with the line between the slave and free states extended from the East Coast out to the Pacific Ocean, but there was not another free state available to bring in for the North to maintain the political balance. So Polk demanded that California come in entirely as one free state to counterbalance Texas coming in with slavery. The annexation of Texas meant certain war with Mexico, so it was imperative that Fremont and the Navy save the whole of California for America to deprive Mexico of using the west coast above Baja for military operations. The Navy sent Gillespie by sea to Veracruz, while 5 American warships set sail around South America to arrive off the California coast in the summer of 1846, and a British man-o-war named the Collingwood arrived shortly thereafter, sporting 80 guns, and in Gillespie's dispatch included the warning to Fremont that General Kearny's army was marching across the Southwest with the goal of seizing Southern California for slavery. There were 10,000 Mexicans living in California at the time, a small number compared to the British who had their eye on the west coast of America, and only the Russians had stood in the way of the British. The Russians had a fort just north of San Francisco, and Russians had founded the town of Guadalupe in 1805, and while there were a few Indians in California, the British had become experts at dealing with native aboriginals after all the practice they'd had the world over. Fremont did not like the British because he'd grown up listening to his father's tales about them, and as Gillespie was making his way north to Fremont's outpost at Klamath Lake, the Indians were carrying the news of the coming war on the wind. As soon as Fremont received his orders from Gillespie, the Indians who thought they were under the protection of the British attacked Fremont's camp on the 9th of May, killing 2 of his men. Fremont went after them 3 days later, and the Indians who had attacked Fremont at Klamath Lake had been using English weapons, and Britain had been supplying the Indians for a long time with metal arrowheads from the Hudson's Bay Company post up the Columbia River. Fremont's reprisal was purposefully brutal, and undertaken in order that the survivors would spread the news that the Americans were now at war with Britain in the Pacific Northwest. On his way back to Sutter's Fort, Fremont did the Sutter Buttes massacre on the 30th of May, and Sutter Buttes was 50 miles northwest of Sutter's Fort. Fremont called them the 3 Buttes, and they were at the center of the entire Indian region of Northern California, where all the different tribes regularly came together to practice Kuksu cult rituals, and Kuksu was the creed common to all the Indians of Northern California, and its headquarters was at these 3 Sutter Buttes, and the Indians believed this was the place where they could ascend to the afterlife. When Fremont did the Sutter Buttes massacre, The news of his war with Britain went out like lightning, and within 2 weeks there was not an Indian in the Pacific Northwest who did not know that the British presence in the territory had just met its match. The British Drake had named San Francisco Nova Albion in 1579, a Latin derivative of New England, and the Mexican government had been offering to sell California to the British for cash. So President Polk authorized Fremont to offer the Mexicans in California protection from the British, and Polk had ordered Fremont to accomplish this or to die trying. Fremont had married the woman with whom Polk had fallen in love before she met Captain Fremont. And Polk was well aware that Fremont's mission was a dangerous one, not only from Indian attacks or Mexican soldiers, but mostly because the British desired to add the West Coast to their list of colonies. Britain's primary goal in gaining California was as a place to export thousands of Irish Catholics who were causing trouble back home. And Fremont and Kit Carson and their men fraternized with the sailors from the British warship Collingwood in Monterey Bay and enjoyed each other's company, and in so doing Fremont spread the news to the British about America's intention to incorporate the Pacific Northwest into the Union. A treaty was signed back in Washington, D.C. that month, on the 15th of June, that was called the Oregon Treaty. And then Fremont went back up to San Francisco, 100 miles north of Monterey, and Sacramento was another 100 miles northeast of San Francisco, and Sutter's Fort was 30 miles northeast of Sacramento up the American River from the Sacramento. Governor Vallejo had been running California as though he were a European baron. But in the middle of the night on the 14th of June, Fremont and his drunken bear flaggers showed up at the governor's house in Sonoma, 30 miles north of Oakland, and they helped themselves to Mr. Vallejo's wine cellar, and they broke into his private liquor cabinet, and then they convinced Vallejo to sign a surrender, and then Fremont seized the Presidio in San Francisco. In July, Commodore Robert F. Stockton arrived in Monterey Bay and took command of the 3 American frigates carrying 500 men each and a ship of the line with 800 sailors aboard and 4 sloops with 200 men each, along with their 3 supply ships. Stockton had been asked to be the Secretary of the Navy in previous years, but he declined because he wanted instead to work on building steam-powered warships, the first of which was the USS Princeton, launched in 1843 under Stockton's command, and it had been christened with a bottle of American whiskey. The Princeton had an iron hull and 2 big guns named the Peacemaker and the Oregon, and the Princeton had been the very first screw-driven ship built for the U.S. Navy. Stockton had been born in Princeton, New Jersey, and his grandfather had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and Stockton had designed one of the guns on board the Princeton, and the one he designed blew up, killing some very important people, so Stockton found out that he was not an engineer and stuck to learning about command rather than trying to be an inventor. When Stockton learned that the war with Mexico had been declared in May of 1846 by reading about it in the local Mexican newspaper, Stockton promoted Fremont to major and Gillespie to captain and made Kit Carson a lieutenant, and Stockton sent Fremont and his men aboard the sloop of war Cyane to sail for San Diego, and they went ashore with the Marines and planted the American flag. Stockton's ship, the Congress, sailed from Monterey to Santa Barbara and did the same, and then both ships met in Los Angeles to find that the Mexican governor had fled to Baja. Fremont signed the Treaty of Cahuenga on the 13th of January in 1847, ending the war with Mexico for America, although the war would go on in Mexico for another year. And Fremont signed the treaty in the town that would become Universal City. The American Army, led by General Kearny, would march in 3 weeks after the Navy docked in Los Angeles, And the Army-Navy fight between Commodore Stockton and General Kearny would begin, and Fremont would get caught in the crossfire. Stockton had appointed Fremont the governor of California and commander of the California Battalion Militia, and he had authorized Fremont to sign the Treaty of Cahuenga, and by the time Fremont had put an end to the war with Mexico, his men had killed 11 bears, and at one point a bee had guided Fremont out of battle, which meant a lot to his Mormon friends. The war had been all but over when the army led by General Kearny arrived in Los Angeles after marching across the Arizona desert, and Stockton and Kearny were the same age and held the same rank, and when Kearny arrived in California, he was disgusted with Fremont's Indian clothing that he viewed as distinctly unmilitary. General Kearny had been protecting settlers and wagon trains from Indians for the Army for 2 decades, and so Fremont's dressing in buckskin had particularly offended him. Commodore Stockton's written reports about the victory in Los Angeles had been sent off by mule to President Polk with Kit Carson and a dozen men and 6 Delaware Indians. And Kit Carson swore he would reach Washington within 60 days, but he ran into Kearny's army marching towards California when they were 11 days out of Santa Fe, and Kearny ordered Kit Carson to turn around and guide Kearny's 300 men across the Arizona desert to Los Angeles. Kearny convinced Kit Carson to do this duty because a Mexican had been captured carrying letters boasting about an uprising of insurgents in Los Angeles that was keeping Stockton and Fremont at bay. And General Kearny had planned his military excursion to California for years after learning in 1842 that the Mexicans were involved in the opium trade with China. 1/3 of Kearny's soldiers were Mormons, using the government to pay their way west, and they'd been hoping to leave Kearny's army at Santa Fe and go due north to the Great Salt Lake. And Kit Carson told General Kearny that only 1/3 of his men would survive the journey across the Arizona desert, so Kearny sent 200 of his soldiers back to Santa Fe, where they were needed to fight Navajos. When Kearny and Kit Carson got within 30 miles of Los Angeles, they were gravely attacked by Mexicans, and Kit Carson snuck through the Mexican lines by walking barefoot those 30 miles because he'd removed his boots at night when they were making too much noise, and he'd lost them in the dark. Kit Carson reached Commodore Stockton in December of 1846, and Stockton sent 300 Marines to relieve Kearny just in the nick of time. And this story was described in glorious detail in the chapter Cold Steel of Blood and Thunder, and these Marines who saved General Kearny's battered army were led by the same Gillespie who had delivered the secret orders to Fremont at Sutter's Fort. 2,000 miles from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to the bitter end of the continent, there had never been a march like it in American history. Blood and Thunder, page 205. When General Kearny finally arrived with less than 100 men, Fremont had already been appointed the governor of California by Commodore Stockton, and after putting Fremont in charge, Commodore Stockton was planning on sailing down to invade the west coast of Mexico. Stockton's Marines had just saved Kearny's bacon back in the desert, but there would be neither gratitude nor grace coming from General Kearny, and President Polk had known full well there would be no compromise between the anti-slavery Navy and Kearny's pro-slavery Army. So to counter the power of the Army, President Polk had sent a contingent of 800 Marines on private ships to California that arrived in San Francisco on the 6th of March in 1847, and these troops were to occupy the newly won territory of California from San Francisco down to the Baja, and President Polk had also sent Colonel Richard Mason to relieve Kearny. When Mason arrived, his orders were to promote Fremont to lieutenant colonel, And when General Kearny learned from Mason that Kearny was to be relieved on the 31st of May, Kearny ordered Fremont to stand down, but Fremont refused to take orders from Kearny, and so did his men. It wasn't that Fremont was being insubordinate to the chain of command in the army, which would have made Kearny and not Stockton Fremont's boss, but that Fremont had been authorized in wartime by the Navy, not the Army, and more importantly, Fremont was simply standing up for his own men. For reasons remaining unknown to History Anonymous, Fremont challenged Mason to a duel, and so President Polk ordered Fremont to join a cavalry unit in Mexico, but Fremont never showed up, staying instead in California and calling himself the commander of the Naval Battalion of Mounted Volunteer Riflemen. Kearny ordered Fremont's arrest and proceeded to take him back to Washington, D.C. for a courts-martial, charging him not just with insubordination, but with mutiny and a slew of other related offenses. Kearny would accompany Fremont under arrest back to Washington, D.C., since Kearny had been ordered to go back himself, and they left on the 31st of May in 1847 to convey Fremont back for trial, and they took the California Trail that went through Fort Bridger before joining the Oregon Trail, and on the way east they buried some of the Donner Party's remains. The argument about California being admitted as a free state rather than a slave state hinged on political power, as votes in Congress fell strictly along party lines, and the Republican Whig Party voting against slavery and the Democrats voting for slavery. Fell strictly along party lines, with the Republican Whig Party voting against slavery and the Democrats voting for slavery. The Whigs had started out as the conservative Democrats and were opposed to the Democratic Republicans, and the Whigs had been Federalists while the Democratic Republicans were just Democrats. And President Polk was a states' right fiscal conservative who wanted to keep the government's money in an independent treasury rather than in private banks.